I would just never do that I do on guitar. So, and I've done that before. I've also done that before because I've written songs and I'm like, oh, this is amazing. This is definitely going to be an acoustic guitar song. 100%. I went to bed last night thinking I want to do something in an acoustic guitar. It's been a minute. I want to really lock it in. I spend hours dialing in tones, writing back and forth, bam. And then a few hours into the songwriting, into the instrumental, I'm like, oh man, this synthesizer pad is way much cooler than this acoustic guitar, and I'm just going to delete the guitar now. Or I don't ever delete stuff. I just mute it, hide it, and activate it.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's how it's going, and I'll be like, well, the song has to take priority.
Yeah.
Over anything, and that's something I've always done with working with clients, with artists, with other writers. Is the song has to take priority, not anybody's ego, not what I set out that morning to do, or what I want to be the coolest part.
Wow, I love it.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So can you continue taking us on a tour of the creation of a typical song? Like chronologically, how does it all come together?
So usually I like to come up with, whether I'm, writing by myself, I'm in Nashville or in Atlanta with another songwriter or a producer or an artist. I like to first and foremost start with a vibe. What do I want it to be in my head? And like I said earlier, that doesn't dictate where it's going to end up, but that's where I like to start. I do like listening to music. I like to listen to new stuff that's out for mixing purposes to make sure I know where the drums are hitting, how present the vocals are, how wet the effects are, all that stuff, etc. And then 9 times out of 10, I'll start with the progression, whether it's a keyboard part or a guitar part or bass part. And usually right after I'm happy, I like to move pretty quick in the beginning process. That's how I keep my inspiration. Once I've got the progression down, I like to jump straight into the groove. Drums. And sometimes even when I'm not completely done with the percussion, or if I don't have a B part or a C part, I'll jump straight into the drums. If it's like, a pop track or a rap R&B, I'll go straight to the groove and lock that in immediately. And then I'm spending the next chunk of time in, whether it's a bass line, an 808, and the drums, and making sure everything is glued together and I'm nodding my head correctly.
Yeah.
And then I'll go back and say, okay, well, I need a pre-chorus, or I need a bridge, or I want the verse and hook to have separate progressions, maybe a minor verse and then it jumps into major, but definitely spend a good amount of time on the groove. And as a bass player, as you know, that's one of our strong points. So,
sure.
And it's a very important aspect for music production. Today's climate, especially, but since the, back in the day too. Yeah.
We've kind of luckily gone back into very heavy music, like long, big, strong bottom end music for the,
yes. Yeah.
After a couple of decades of it taking the back seat.
Yeah. Very good for us bass players.
Yeah. I just had Mixer Man on the podcast. I don't know if you've read any of his books, but he was saying it's really fun to listen to 80s music on the Beats headphones, because they just pump up all the low end that wasn't there.
Yeah. And I used to have some Beats headphones. I actually got them when they first came out, and it was too much low end.
It is too much low end, yeah. But not for 80s music.
Right, yeah. And I've actually been going in on 80s style production. Not only doing like 80s little things here and there, which is, it's definitely coming back around.
Yeah, like the gated snares and the...
Mm-hmm, yep, and all the old school, like the 80s MIDI synths and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But also I've been going back in trying to make for sync, for putting, for TV and film, straight up 80s sounding stuff, where sometimes the mix might not even sound good for today's climate, but that's not what I'm going for.
Right.
And so I've been studying 80s music for this whole year. I mean, terribly, terribly studying 80s music. And I love the fact that also that was right on the cusp of having these producers and bands these producers that are shooting for number ones. You had a lot more one-hit wonders than you do today, because nowadays a lot of stuff is written. There's producers, songwriters that's what they do. Even for full bands, they will hire a producer and songwriter team to make their album for them. Back then, there would be bands that would pop off with some random song.
Yeah.
And it's, everybody can sing along to, but to this day, I could not tell you who it was. I'd have to look it up. And I think there's something special about that. And I've been studying that, especially just for tones and stuff. But and everything. So a lot of it is smaller, thinner. Some songs I'm like, man, I love this song. And when I listen back to it in the studio, I'm like, what, did they just roll everything off at like 100 or something? Like,
yeah. Somebody I don't know if this is true, but somebody told me it's like all the cocaine they were doing in the 80s, and it just kind of made their hearing just want more high end or whatever.
That's the cocaine mix.
Yeah.
So a lot of drugs, especially cocaine, alcohol does this too. It suppresses your high end. It actually
Wow.
affects a lot of your hearing, but the cocaine actually suppresses a lot of your high end. So what they would do to compensate would boost the high end. So you can listen to a lot of these mixes, and it might not even affect the low end, but where they would go to compensate for the high end, they would just boost it. So, and if it's, where it's going to come off to us, sometimes not even as super bright, but sometimes as brash or harsh.
Yeah.
But they would be numb, their ears or whatever hearing would actually be numb to that.
So
same
crazy.
with a lot of older mixers, guys that are, have been doing it for a long time. And a lot of these old engineers that have made their way to the studio, were on tour with bands for decades.
Yeah.
So they're hearing, because the first thing to go is your high end starts deteriorating. So older mix engineers have to be careful, from what I've read, to make sure they're not overcompensating for the lack of high
Top end. Wow.
Yep.
Yeah. Amazing. So anyways, I think I cut you off. You were in the middle of talking more about your productions. The most important thing for you is getting like the groove going, and then you'll kind of fill in the rest of like the choruses and the pre-choruses, etc. So,
yep. And even from the beginning, because I know a lot of people say, save the mixing for later. Save the mixing for after you're done with the songwriting and the production. And I get that, because you don't want that part of your brain to mess up the other part, the creative flow. But as somebody who was fascinated and, started engineering and stuff from an early stage, the mixing is part of the production for me, the songwriting. If the 808 is clashing with the kick drum, I'm not nodding my head correctly. I'm not feeling the groove from the start. So to me, it's not exciting me, inspiring me to spend another 5 or 6 hours on this instrumental. So I'm mixing from the get go. And then once I get all of that mixed, I'm going to be mixing from start to finish. But then I'm adding, I love to take the transitions is a big part for me. I love to go in on transitions. I want it to be like, I don't ever want to listen back to an instrumental before I pitch it to an artist. Well, sometimes I do pitch instrumentals that's like a kick, a snare, a hi-hat, an 808, and 4 chords. But I have noticed over the past decade or more that artists are 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 times more likely to choose an instrumental if you're just producing like that is more fleshed out, or almost sounds more complete.
Sounds like a record.
Yep. And sometimes I do like starting from a smaller point where it's just a scratch, a demo, because then I can work around it with artists. But I have noticed that most artists will choose something that's more fleshed out. So lately, these days, when I'm writing instrumentals by myself, I will go in on it, on the transitions. I will listen back to it in the car, and anytime there's a point where I'm like, well, that's slightly awkward, it's probably not that big of a deal, no, I will go back in until I listen to it, and I'm like, I literally can't think of anything else to do on this.
Amazing. Do you have any hot tips for transitions? Anything you do in particular that's fun?
I got some secrets. I'm trying to think of which ones I can release to the internet.
Up to you. There's no pressure.
No, I'm just messing. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of standard stuff. I mean, I'd like to think that I've created some cool stuff on accident or experimenting, but you can only reinvent the wheel so many times. There's stuff that I used to leave out because I didn't want to be generic. But then I started putting stuff back in, like reverse crashes. I will spend a lot of time on those, and I've been putting them back into my production a lot more. And it's just like, because I used to think, well, everybody's doing a reverse swell into a transition. But everybody uses kick drums and snare drums and keyboards and, hi-hats and 808s and acoustic guitars. it's like I'm not going to say like, well, I'm going to stop using guitars because everybody uses guitars. That's kind of how I look at it. But now I go in a lot more where I will have like 4, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate verse crashes or cymbal swells going into transitions. Some will drag out, and I'll throw a bunch of reverb on them where they swell over into the chorus. Sometimes they do the and they stop right before. Sometimes I'll stop on the snare right before the downbeat for the chorus. Sometimes I'll start on the downbeat of the chorus. And then I'll use a shitload of other reverse transitions, whether that's the standard reverse reverb tail off of the first word of the downbeat, or I'll take samples from Splice where they're reverse vocal swells in the same key of the song I'm working on. And then it'll be somebody else's vocal that they did that to. And I'll just drag and drop it, cut it off, chop it up, stretch it however I need to. Yeah, I mean, I'm always reversing stuff. It's that's another thing that I used to not do. I'd be like, well, everybody's reversing stuff. And now I'm starting to go back into stuff and not only use it a lot more, but experiment with it more, on an individual basis. Song to song.
Tweaking, not just dropping.
Yeah. Yep. Tweaking and going in, tweaking, spending a good amount of time on little transitions. And like I would on a verse or a chorus, go back in on that transition and really put the time in.
Amazing. What influences your decisions when it comes to structure and arrangement?
That's a good question too. So, when I'm writing with an artist and producing from scratch in the room, it's a lot easier because I can be like, hey, do you need, 8 bars for the verse? Do you need 12? Should the hook be 16? And they'll say, well, hold on, let me write down. But before we start recording vocals, I'll map it out with them. 9 times out of 10, when I'm working with an artist and I have the instrumental, they choose one from a folder to start writing to and recording. They'll say, hey, can we shorten that verse, that first verse or the second verse? I used to spend a lot more time trying to figure out, arrangements and stuff, only to go into a session and the artist every time being like, oh yeah, chop that up, do this, cut that in half. We don't even need that part. And then I'm like, oh, but I spent 6 hours on that bridge, so, but it's about the song, so I'll spend a good amount of time, and I also really just go for what feels good to me. I'll do intros, outros, pre-hooks, verses, choruses, throw a bridge in there, maybe, and really just whatever feels good to me, but also knowing that, the artist is probably going to do their thing, hopefully. Sometimes it just fits perfectly, and they're like, oh, it's perfect. We don't need to change anything. But, I love working with artists. I love when they have ideas and lyrically, lyrical content, they're like, well, I need an extra like 3 bars just to repeat this phrase at the end. Okay, cool. And, in the recording session, you just chop up the instrumental in Pro Tools, move it around. And then when I import the instrumental, all the stems from Logic later on, then I'll just, make sure to match it up with whatever we did in the tracking session, the writing session.
Dope. So it sounds like you're doing you're kind of mixing as you're going along with the actual song, instrumental writing process in Logic. Then once you have that all mixed out, you're kind of exporting it as stems, adding it to Pro Tools, which you're using for your vocal sessions.
Usually for vocal sessions, I will record with just a 2-track. Mm-hmm. Even if I have the stems ready and exported, I will just do a 2-track. It saves a lot of space just in case the vocal session becomes massive.
100 tracks.
As they can.
Yeah.
And it's also easier to just chop up and be like, okay, hey, cut that verse in half. Bam, click, 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 bam, I'm done.
Right.
But I do when once I get the vocals recorded, I will go back into Logic, finish mixing the instrumental, which 9 times out of 10 is pretty close, but I love working in 2 DAWs because I can mix the beat and get it super, drums hitting hard, vibed out, and space in it, EQ'd, and then by the time I import the stems into Pro Tools for the final mix, the instrumental is almost ready, and I don't have to really put much processing on it in Pro Tools, where I have all the vocals and everything else.
Amazing.
One thing I am careful of a lot more now is compression. Compression for making stuff hit harder, like drums and stuff. I'll do that all day long, but like squeezing guitars, keyboards, bass especially, I will save that for Pro Tools. I will, EQ, saturate, distortion, a little bit of compression, but then if I'm really wanting to squeeze something or pump it, I'll do that in Pro Tools because, once it's squeezed, it's hard to take that off of it later on once it's been printed in.
Oh, so you are kind of mixing in stages because your final mix will